Welcome once again to Cannon Falls Community Television and our Talk of the Town, the first ever Talk of the Town program. I'm Rod Johnson, your host, and like I said earlier, we look forward to bringing you interesting guests and topics in upcoming episodes. And I'm excited about what we have next year because I'm kind of a history buff, and we're going to talk right now about Jesse James and his outlaw gang, and we have Loren Evenrud with us, who is chairman of Shepherdson Tour, and we also have with us Bob Rohl, who is somewhat of a historian on Jesse James, and thank both of you for being here. First of all, Bob, how did you develop an interest in Jesse James and history like this?
Well, I always was interested in cowboys,
Yeah.
Native Americans, but I hated history.
Okay.
And it took me a long time to realize that this cowboy and Native American items I was interested in was history.
History.
Then Jesse James, of course, being a notorious outlaw, I had heard about him as a little child. And I moved down to Wanamingo Township, a farm. And I'm up working on the roof shortly after I moved. And this older car comes in, and he parks in the yard. And I figure it's some salesman or something. And I don't want to crawl down. And I told the kids there up with me, we'll wait till he goes away. And he still sat there. So finally I decided, well, I better go down and see what he wants. Well, it turned out it was an old neighbor historian. I hadn't known him, by the name of Vince Benson.
Okay.
And he says, you know, Jesse James camped on your ground. I said, yeah, right.
On your ground, yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. So I said, yeah, right. And we chatted a bit, and then he left. And what that did is plant the seed to either prove or disprove the likelihood of it. And that's how I got interested in it.
Great. And we're gonna talk about some of the local connections with Jesse James, and of course that day on September 7th, 1876, when they tried to rob the Northfield Bank but were defeated. And Bob's going to fill us in on a lot of interesting things about that. But I want to talk to you, Loren, a little bit, and you and I have talked about this, what is the fascination with an outlaw like Jesse James? Because when it comes right down to it, he was not really a good person, was he?
You're very perceptive.
Yeah.
That's been my interest for years. Bob and I met about 5 years ago, and we had lunch and chatted, and I realized that he really is a resource that is very rare in terms of the history of outlaws, and certainly the history of Jesse James, because so much of what has been shared in the 45 movies done on Jesse's life, the 8 television specials, the hundreds of books and articles, it is based on legend for the most part, because there's no one alive that actually really talked to him, so we got ancestors of people that share stories. And my story is when I was a young lad growing up on a farm in northeast Iowa, near Decorah, Iowa. On Sunday afternoons, my grandfather, obviously didn't know Jesse and was younger than Jesse, would sit around smoking his pipe, Prince Albert pipe tobacco. I remember it vividly. And my uncles would be there, and some of the uncles would smoke cigarettes, some would smoke pipes. And I'm this little kid listening in, and the topic was either Harry Truman or Jesse James. And it really stuck with me because I couldn't understand how they could be talking about Jesse James when he basically
so many years ago, a criminal.
I mean, how could they glamorize a criminal? Yeah. And so that kind of got me interested over the years, and I made a point of looking into what I call the outlaw conundrum, folk hero or common criminal, because really that's our choice. Are we going to glamorize this and make movies out of it, write books, or are we going to call it what it is, a criminal person, a violent criminal person? Jesse's notoriety comes from being a gang leader, gangster, and we know about gangsters in our society. We glamorize some of those gang leaders too, by the way. Stanley Tookie Williams he created the L.A. Crips, and he has been executed, but he was writing children's books, and people were writing him letters and glamorizing his role as a leader of the L.A. Crips. You could talk about John Dillinger, Al Capone. You can even go down the list, look at Patty Hearst, Sarah Jane Olson, and Charles Manson. We don't want to forget Charles Manson, because he gets more mail today in his he's 80-some years old than any other incarcerated person in, I believe, the world. And people still write him. He's fascinating. So my interest has always been, why do we glamorize criminal behavior? Is it the thrill? Is it something in our nature? Is it the mass media? Is it our culture? I certainly don't think it's religious, because the Ten Commandments are very clear on what's right and what's wrong. So I've taken more of a global look at this over the years in my teaching and my professional experience, and trying to understand why it is we glamorize criminals. And Bob, bless his soul, has zeroed in on an area around Cannon Falls prior to September 7th, 1876, where Jesse James and his gang spent a little time before the raid. And I find that fascinating personally. So.
And Bob, maybe let's go back and just talk a little bit on Jesse James. You know, at what age did he start, swaying the wrong way?
Quite frankly, that's a tough question.
Yeah.
It was quite young.
Was.
Yes.
Teenager, probably.
Yes, teenager. Yes, it was a teenager. I think 15, but I'm just speculating.
Now, was he involved in, the Confederate Army?
No, he was involved with Quantrell's Raiders, and they were so harsh and brutal that when they did try to join the Confederate Army, the Confederate Army refused to take them.
Because they were so brutal?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
And he, of course, Missouri, hometown, right?
That is correct.
Yeah.
That is correct.
So eventually, they start robbing banks.
They were
life
some
crime.
They were some of the first to start train robberies and bank robberies. In fact,
Daytime, too.
Daytime,
Yes, and that they made a point of being bold enough to do it during the day. Yeah.
And you all got to remember, in the times, these railroads and banks were not looked upon benevolently by the general population. In fact, they were hated.
Yeah.
And so these robbers were allowed or enjoyed cover, secrecy. So
now, let's talk about how the Northfield bank robbery attempt first started out. I mean, why did Jesse James and his gang decide to come to Minnesota?
Well, there is a Minnesota connection.
Okay.
And it's a fellow by the name of Bill Stiles. And he was in Cannon Falls.
So it's even a Cannon Falls connection.
That's correct. He was in Cannon Falls at least the winter previous to the raid, in other words, 75, 76. And he was stayed at a boarding house with the flour mill worker.
Okay.
And his sister was a school teacher in the Cannon Falls.
Okay.
They said the Cannon Falls High School, but I haven't been able to document that. In Cannon Falls area is what I'd say right now. Then she married a Cannon Falls resident by the name of Peterman. Caleb was his first name.
Okay.
And the interesting part of that is, and I'll jump way ahead, on the Northfield raid, the Stiles was killed. And I have a conflict with the Northfield Historical Society. They identify him as Chadwell, a totally different individual, and my documentation would point to that he's Stiles. This brother-in-law went there and made a positive identification on the body.
That it was Stiles.
Yes. He said if it is him, he will have a scar under the left arm. They raised the arm up, and there's the scar.
Okay. So Stiles from Cannon, or from the Cannon Falls connection.
Yes.
Did he kind of give Jesse James the idea to come up to Northfield?
Yes.
Okay.
In his connections, he talked about how rich these farmers were in these banks. And there was other areas too. A guy by the name of Silver Spoon's butler. He was in charge of New Orleans during the Reconstruction after the Civil War. And he got the name of Silver Spoons because he liberated anything of any value that he could there. And he was hated. And he was, it was his son-in-law, a fellow by the name of Delbert Ames, that was, I think, president of the bank at Northfield. But they originally started to rob a bank in Red Wing.
Oh, really?
And they looked around there, and they didn't like the escape routes due to the fact that the river blocked it at least 50% on the escape routes. And then they in turn went to Mankato because that was another one. And a lot of attention got there, and somebody recognized them. So then they came back to Northfield.
Okay, and they settled on
Yes.
attempting to rob the Northfield.
And there was only one bank at Northfield as opposed to three, so they felt that that really would have a...
And the James, Jesse, and Frank kind of joined up with the Youngers, right?
Correct.
And so they start making the trek up here to Minnesota. Whereabouts, tell us a little bit about the surrounding area and maybe some places they stayed and how the farmers had already, did they realize who these people were?
No to that answer.
Okay.
But they came into St. Paul by railroad.
Okay.
Then they bought 2 fast horses there and raced them in the streets, so they made sure they got the fastest horses and so on and so forth. Then they went by railroad again to Red Wing, because this is, of course, where they were going to. Then there's some local area after they left Red Wing. Well, they bought more horses, 6 more horses in Red Wing. They bought McClellan saddles. McClellan's saddle is a military saddle, and that was developed by the Army by the officer by the name of McClellan. They personally selected bits that were of the military type. And these guys were projecting an image of military. That's what people looked at. When they see these military-type horses, they were a thoroughbred cross. And the McClellan saddles and the bits they were riding, and the heavy armament they had. So then after they leave Red Wing, they go into Hayes Creek, District 113 school. And there they camped the night.
In Hay Creek.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they terrorized some of the local residents to get meals out of them. And bear in mind, the local residents couldn't get out of there to spread the alarm because they were felt to be observed. And then they went into White Rock, and there's spots in between where they asked directions, et cetera, et cetera. And White Rock and had some horses shod. They then went to Hayter area.
Okay.
And Hayter is an interesting spot. At that time, it was the main road between Dubuque and St. Paul, the main stage line.
So is that kind of where Highway 52 runs, was kind of the main
Yes.
stage line? Okay.
Yes. Generally, that is it. The interesting thing about there, and I'll throw in a little other history that's not related to James, but they drove cattle in the 1700s out of Prairie du Chien up to Pembina in North Dakota, what's now North Dakota, which just fascinated the devil out of me. Then in turn, after Hayter, and at that time there was a stage stop and some kind of a restaurant, bar, and I think a hotel. It's all gone now. Yeah. And from there they went into it had been...
Did they go to the Asplund area at all?
Yes,
Yeah.
this was before the Asplund area.
Okay, before Asplund.
Yeah, I was trying to think of the name. I think it was a Gemsey farm.
Okay.
And there they allegedly, depending on what historical writings, recordings you wish to believe, either bought a horse or they bought oats. Well, I doubt they bought horses, because the horses in this area would have been light draft horses, and that isn't the type of horses they were after. They'd have to have been real desperate to buy one.
Yeah.
And from there, they went and allegedly camped on my land. So therefore, I believe they bought oats.
Yeah.
Because these thoroughbred type horses are not good browsers, good hustlers.
yeah.
They have to have grain. So they camped there the night and then went into the Asplund area. Now the local church there is written up that they robbed the store at Asplund.
Really?
Well, I don't feel that's accurate.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. These guys were operating a cover as, first of all, they were railroad land buyers, or they were cattle buyers, or they were horse buyers. And they weren't going to knock over some little store they might get a $20 out of when they're after these bigger fish of a big bank. Then, in turn, from there, they went to was then called Norway, and it's gone now.
Yeah, yeah.
And from there they were inquiring where the Brecky Bridge was. And the reason being, apparently they all weren't camped or at this site because they wanted to meet the rest of the people at this Brecky Bridge, which tells me they had to have some local guidance because this bridge is off in the woods.
And maybe Stiles was one of them, you think? Or
That's
I mean,
what
how
I-
many were traveling together, do you think?
Well, there was allegedly 8 robbers.
Okay.
And Koblos will make a case that there was a 9th one. And he believes it might be Stiles, that's what he
Okay.
implies. But they had split up. See, that's the other thing that puzzles me. When you're researching this, first of all, you got them here, and at the same time, you got them over here. And that puzzled me for a long time. But then I realized that they had split up. And both recollections may be accurate.
Yeah.
Because they came together at this
At the
Brecky
bridge.
Bridge, yes.
And they used assumed names too a lot of
Yeah.
times, so
Yes, they
the
did.
locals wouldn't know him as Jesse James, but the locals would have heard about the legend, the reputation of these bad outlaws. And remember, communication was telegraph, I suspect, or postcards, or mail, or the stagecoach, or the railroad. So it always puzzles me how they could communicate when they didn't have cell phones and a way to talk to each other, you know. So that's always been a curiosity from my perspective.
It was funny too, we were talking a little bit before you went on here about how so many people say, Jesse James camped on my farm, he camped, you know, and it's nice to hear what really happened now. Because that's, legend, it's he was here, he was there. But so they get to the Brecky Bridge, you say, and,
Yes.
and then they're, you know, getting ready to go into Northfield. Do you have any idea how much money they thought they could get out of the Northfield Bank? I mean, was it any amounts ever mentioned?
I think I did see in one area perhaps 15,000. And that doesn't sound like much today.
Oh, but back then, yeah.
Yes. Bear in mind, at those times, a team of horses you could trade for 80 acres of land and so
Wow.
on. And horses were very expensive commodities and so on. 15,000 just have been a huge amount of money at that time.
We're talking again with Bob Rohl, historian on Jesse James and his outlaw gang. Loren Evenrud is with us as well, and we've been kind of talking about Jesse James and his gang and this area where they stayed at. And we've actually, Shepherdson is doing a tour, and Loren, you might want to chime in on this too, but Bob has agreed to kind of be the leader of this tour. We're going to get on a deluxe motor coach bus on Saturday, September 6th. We're going to have a great day, and we're actually going to go and visit these spots that you've heard Bob talk about where, you know, they intermingled, where bought horses or oats or camped or whatever, and we're going to kind of take that route in the morning. We're going to end up in Denison at noon and have a lunch there. Then, Loren, you lined up the Northfield Historical Society going to give us a little tour? Or?
Yeah, the Northfield Historical Society will give us a tour of their collection, and then the tour will end, and the people on the tour will see the reenactment in time to get on the bus and come back to Cannon Falls by 5. So we're calling it a rolling classroom. That's how I view it.
Because that day, it's also during Northfield's defeat of
That's
Jesse
right.
James Day, so there will be a reenactment of the bank
That's
robbery.
right.
That's what I want to cover next.
Okay.
Is the robbery itself. So we've kind of followed along and seen where they went, and they're at the Brecky Bridge, and from there, did they go right into Northfield then? They kind of met is kind of what we're thinking, right?
Yes. Apparently they came together, and they split up again and came together outside of Northfield.
So they had scoped it out. Evidently, they tell us then as they went into Northfield.
Well,
things definitely did not go well for Jesse
No,
James and his gang that day.
a couple of them, and the name escapes me which ones they were, started drinking for some reason, and
okay.
they got a little too much whiskey. And they did scope the area out. They stopped and asked hardware dealers what type of people were they here, and so on and so forth. In other words, they were looking to see if they were going to be a soft touch or not. And then they talked and tried to find out the armament and so on and so forth. And they, when they went into the bank,
Now, who went into the bank? Was it Frank and Jesse? Or only a couple went into the bank and they had a couple
About
looking out?
3, I believe.
Three?
Now,
Okay.
Now that's the area I'm somewhat familiar with. But not-
Okay,
yeah.
all right.
Hopefully the people that.
Yeah, yeah.
But there were, to my recollection, Frank, Jesse, and I forget who the third one was
Okay.
who went into the bank. And they attribute one of them this drinking, that's why Haywood got shot. In other
Okay.
words, he didn't use the best rationale and so on and so forth.
And their timing was off. They were having one group come across the bridge and another group go into the bank, and again, their communication was off, and things didn't go well.
Yeah,
And,
they wanted him to open the safe and he refused to open the safe. right?
and they had researched the safe. It was a brand new safe with a special time combination that was unique to this bank, and so they were frustrated that Hayward wouldn't let him in, and then I think they shot him as an afterthought as they were leaving. But I'm glad they changed the name to Defeat
Yeah.
of Jesse
Do you know when they
James.
did that? It's
Well,
a while. It's been a while.
When they did it, I'm thinking half a dozen
Yeah.
years ago, but I just looking at the research and the books that have been written, I think people realize that we really don't need to be glamorizing a murderer. And you might wonder how the word spread about Jesse James so early. There were dime novels that were written and circulated throughout the United States, and I'm sure my grandfather had access to some of those dime novels. But even today, in the 70s, we have the True Wild West magazine, The West, and articles about styles and so forth. It is a topic that has fascinated people for generations. That's why I like to separate the fact from fiction, and that's what Bob can do.
And you look at, we're talking about a bank robbery in Northfield, Minnesota back then, and what impresses me is the townspeople. They heard that shot, and what did they do? They went and armed themselves and more or less took on the gang, wouldn't you say, Bob?
Oh, yes, yes. See, the alarm was given before they actually, while they were in the process
Okay.
of getting in the bank. And various townspeople, one of them got a Smith carbine, which was a military surplus of cavalry. Another one got a Remington rolling block, which was a 45-70, which is a close range, even long range. That was a buffalo gun in those days. And then the rest of the town had been out prairie chicken hunting, because prairie chickens were very common. You could fill up a wagon box in a couple of hours. So anyway, they were getting shot up by this bird shot, and the bird shot wasn't killing them, but it was
doing its job.
the blood was running on faces and so on. But then Manning, who got into action with this 45-70, and he's the one that shot Stiles.
Okay.
Then Wheeler was shooting this carbine, and he got Pitts, I believe, was the other one.
And both of those were killed.
Both of them were killed.
The Youngers were wounded.
They were shot up,
Yeah.
but they weren't killed.
But they were captured, what,
Yes.
week or two later?
Yes, that would be about right.
And Jesse and Frank, they got away without getting hit, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of an interesting one, too. I can put the Stiles family in Sherburne County on 1870 census. And allegedly, Frank and Jesse James went to Dakota Territory and then made their escape down the border into Missouri. In 1880, I can place the Stiles family again in Dakota Territory. Now, is it a connection or is it just a coincidence? I have no idea.
It is very interesting, though, just to, especially the local connection.
Yes, yes.
We talk about Stiles and we talk about Cannon Falls, and I'm kind of agreeing with you that I think that's who it was.
Yes, because that brother-in-law made a very
Yeah.
positive identification.
And again, we've got a great historical tour coming up, Jesse James Tour, and as we talked about the different sites, you can come along, you can see those sites, and you can take in a whole day, and we'd love to have you. If people are interested, just give Shepherd Center a call at 507-263-2136. We'll get you signed up. Limited number, of course, on the bus. And that was the date, September 7th, 1876, the defeat of Jesse James, and they tried to rob the bank in Northfield. And Loren Evenrud, Chairman of Shepherd Center, thank you for being here. Bob Rohl, appreciate it, man. I could talk all day about this. Thank you so much.
And I enjoy talking about it.
Great, great.
I can attest to that. He does enjoy talking about it.
It's just fascinating to me because I love history and things like this. When you get the local connection, it's just great. I hope you enjoyed it today. We talked the brand new hospital. We talked Jesse James and his outlaw gang and how they were defeated in Northfield, Minnesota. So that's about going to wrap it up for our first ever edition of Talk of the Town. We thank you for watching. Hope you can join us on the tour. And on behalf of Cannon Falls Community Television and Talk of the Town, I'm Rod Johnson.
We grew to 92,000 square feet. So we're about 3 times bigger than where we were at the other facility.
The design of the building actually narrows a little bit as it goes a little bit more to the west, intentionally so that those rooms that are closer to the nurse station intended for our more critically ill patients. So our nurses are able to respond faster.